Hello and good morning. We've been discussing the idea of personality theory, and we spent a great deal of time on Tuesday uh, discussing the ideas of Freud. And I hope that you walk away with several concepts that were emphasized during that lecture, including but not limited to the fact that he is not a psychologist and didn't publish anything resembling a psychological experiment, but he's very much part of our culture and what we think about the foundation of personality theory. But one of the things that we discussed, but very briefly, and I want to emphasize today as a foundation for today's lecture on personality theory that's more modern, is the idea that it is somewhat negative. The world, according to Freud, is not positive. We're here to kind of hang on for dear life, fight off the difficulties that the world gives us, and along those lines, then deal with the difficulties that we cannot engage with properly. We develop defense mechanisms, among other things, as a way to try and compensate for the anxieties that come with balancing the id and the superego. This leaves us a sort of a negative, a bad taste in our mouth, and much later in our thinking, especially starting in the '60s, with the advent of the so-called hippie movement, we start thinking of a more of a positive view of life. And I'd like to take you down that road for just a few moments. And I'd like to talk to you about three individuals, two that are historical, one that's contemporary. The idea that I want to bring forth to start off with is that of Abe Maslow, who died in 1970. Abraham Maslow was born in Brooklyn, New York, from very much of a working family, a Jewish family in a multi-ethnic neighborhood where he himself was not well regarded and had a significant challenge during his early years. He went to school in the area before going on to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he worked with the famous Harry Harlow and the experiments involving wired monkeys. His master's thesis was not something he was particularly proud of, and actually took it and ripped it apart and took it away from the library at the University of Wisconsin. His dissertation was much more sophisticated, but still, I think something maybe he may have not been that proud of. He left to go to Columbia University and then settled at Brooklyn College before spending some time at Brandeis University in Boston, and subsequently ended up in Menlo Park, California, where he died. Somewhat of an early death. He died at the age of 70 while jogging in the streets of Menlo Park, California. I think at that point he may have been associated with a new psychology program at Alliant University, or what used to be called California School of Professional Psychology. He wrote several books, and probably one that is thought of as maybe most important um, is that of um, on becoming a person. Um, the book by Maslow had many ideas, and I'd like to share with you several. Um, First of all, he developed the idea that we all have needs, and the needs have to be met. Uh, and there's basically what we call a hierarchy of needs, which is easily Googled if you take a moment to take a look at that, or any good psychology textbook. And that the hierarchy of needs is a pyramid where many of us are at the bottom of the pyramid, and some of us are at the top of the pyramid. Uh, at the very, very, very bottom of the pyramid, it's what we call biological needs. In other words, this is essentially what we consider to be fundamental. If we don't take care of this, then theoretically there's nothing that can go beyond that. If you go a little bit higher than biological needs, it's a sense that we get into the more significant aspects of life. Maybe we could say maybe a little bit more complicated and maybe even more positive. And that is what we might call safety. Safety is the knowledge that everything is under control. In other words, we know what tomorrow brings. We know that we have food, and for that matter, this is essentially the foundation of predictability. These two are really important. If you want to, you're welcome to call the first one physiological needs, which includes food, water, and so forth. So the basic need of just getting by. These two are a requirement. In fact, if we don't have these two, we're really kind of in serious trouble. Almost all of us have physiological needs met, not all, but most. Some more because of, or I should say, some less have safety taken care of. That is, that you're being tended to by parents, friends, and so forth. And then we go to the next one, which is what we call belonging or love. Some people would just call this love. So it reminds me of that song, I Feel Like Making Love. Is that what we're talking about here? No, this is zero having to do with physiological needs. This is all about intimate, warm relationships of friends, parents, maybe loved ones as well. This is a fundamental need as we go further down. Now, again, as I sort of emphasize, this social need of love is a little higher, and by definition, we tend to have fewer opportunities for this, and as we achieve this, we are then fortunate maybe to have the next step, which is a little bit less frequent as we have discovered, and that is, I'm trying to do something here. Sorry, and that particular need that's coming up is still psychological, but maybe not as frequently seen as some of the ones that we've talked about. And this next one is esteem. Esteem is a sense of not feeling good about, for example, acquiring things, but it's feeling good about having a sense of prestige and feeling of accomplishment. In other words, I've gotten there because I've done good. I've been good to people. I've done a good job. I've fulfilled my duty, whatever it is that you're pursuing. And then at the very top is what we might call self-actualization, and this is something that occurs very, very infrequently. And as the idea implies, this is again something that is at the very peak and very infrequent. There, according to Maslow, relatively few self-actualized individuals, and those individuals tend to often, if they're self-actualized, believe that they're not, because this is not something that is technically frequently seen. If you uh, study these individuals, and as Maslow did, one of the things that turns out to be fascinating was his his ideas of that the people that were at this level were infrequently and frequently seen and tend to focus not on who they are, but on problems outside of themselves. They may have a better understanding of social conventions, and in his study of them, he discovered these people were, for example, were full of life, not internally drawn. They were maybe whole, what today we might call sustainable. They were alive, full of opportunities, full of willingness to try and new ideas. They believe in social justice, a sense of fairness, a sense of value to others. They believed in concepts of right and wrong, for that matter. They were not. They were ease. They engaged what today we often refer to as flow. They would tend to be funny and playful, full of life. They were good people, self-sufficient people, full of truth. Uh, Maybe they were perfect, but in imperfect ways. They were willing to appreciate the limitations and so forth. One could argue that if you were truly self-fulfilled, there was no necessary reason to tell others that you were. In fact, you wouldn't go around saying that. The opposite. You would feel whole internally, and not necessarily feel like you were and need to share with others. One of the things that sometimes comes from this uh, place of being self-actualized is that you have what we might call peak experiences. Now, peak experience is not like getting high or having sex. It's not that at all. It's unexpected periods. You can't necessarily work towards them. They happen. They sink from above without a clear idea of what's going on. A sense of happiness or love, understanding. I don't know. A sense of purpose, validation, that you understand that why you're here. Aha, I get it. I know this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And sometimes they're just so darn unexpected that you don't know that they're headed your way. But when they do happen, they they are they are fulfilling and comprehensive, and add uh, this anchoring of this is who I am. Sometimes also people that are in this particular place, if you will, um, are often associated with having what you call metacognition or meta motivation. They're just like wildly driven, wildly forced to try and do beyond what's normal, and very often they are driven to what he referred to as a narcissism that was maybe whole or correct. And theoretically, these people were here not only to achieve, but not necessarily to for themselves, but for the greater good. Uh, this idea, or these ideas that I'm sharing with you, are very, 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 very much associated with a movement that became so popular in the 60s and maybe the 70s. And sadly enough, it's just taken a backseat to all of this. And that is what we might call humanistic psychology. The idea that the human was at the center of all of this. Sadly enough, it's just um, not not necessarily thought of as very positively. Some probably have probably challenged this because it's um, not very scientific. It's hard to put into specific independent, dependent variables and confounding variables as we've talked about. So it's probably not considered as much as in in uh, in uh, in vogue as we had at one point. Of some note is that this movement, this humanistic movement, was encapsulated by or merged with the hippie movement of the '60s um, in San Francisco. In case you forgot, he actually died in San Francisco, and in some ways it became so intertwined with that maybe it lost its significance in psychology. It certainly was important to many of us, and it was many of us got into psychology during this particular period because of this humanistic movement. But sadly enough, at this particular juncture, is not as important as it used to be. So here we are, enjoying the ideas of Maslow. I do want to share a short story because part of the problem is that we don't have a lot of knowledge about these people because they've come and gone. But one of my peers, Matty Cantor, was a student of Carl Rogers of Abe Maslow, and suggested that he actually was not a particularly nice guy, was not very kind of all people to women. She said he was an amazing psychotherapist, but he was not necessarily the greatest of teachers. So one of the giants in the beginning of the humanistic movements, along with Carl Rogers, who was born in '02 and died in 1987. For whatever reason, I happen to know also how he died. He was also doing physical activity, fell in La Jolla, California, and went in to get a hip replacement and died of an unsuspecting medical condition and a heart attack. Anyway, about Carl Rogers, he was born in the middle part of the U.S. in Oak Park, I believe that's a suburb of Chicago, where he had a congregationalist background. His parents were devout Christians, and if you will, at least middle class or professional class, well regarded in the community. Her mom was more of a Baptist, but still, they were successful people. He was the 4 of 6 children. Just very normal, very good. He was very influenced by his parents, and specifically went um, to consider a very different career path that we might see for a psychologist. He went to the University of Wisconsin and was majoring in history, but he after getting his degree, he went to China on a conference, and he wasn't sure about what he was to do because the conference, the trip was actually a sort of a missionary trip, and he came back and attended why should I be a missionary or if you will, a minister. And he went to Union Theological Seminary in New York to pursue this idea that he should be a minister. Unsuccessfully so, because halfway through he decided he needed to consider going teacher's college at Columbia University, where he got his master's and PhD, and I believe in clinical psychology. It was one of the first people to get a degree in clinical psychology, which is sort of unusual because today that's one of the big degrees, but not then. And he then went to Rochester to work at a council for prevention of child cruelty. Sort of unusual. We don't think of psychologists making a big that went to work for a facility like that, but he had been influenced by the works of people like Otto Rank and others that had actually studied with Freud. So he was sort of starting to lean towards writing all this up, and wrote a book on treatment of children. And he went on to the University of Chicago along with my own mentor back in the late 40s, early 50s, where he started a counseling center, and that was unusual. He actually taught in the psychology department, and him and Rod and Sperry were colleagues and continued the relationship when both him and Sperry moved to California. He went on to teach a couple of places, University of Wisconsin, Madison, where he wrote his most famous book, which I'll tell you in a second, and then subsequent to that, he went on to do a stint in La Jolla, California, where he actually ended up staying his entire life, and where he ended up dying as well. One of the things that I think is important to Rogers in his probably his most famous book was Client-Centered Psychotherapy. This client-centered therapy, I should say, not psychotherapy, therapy, which came out in 1951, was one of the greatest books that is in the clinical psychology world, and it's still read widely today. It's a foundation of probably the most common non-empirical, if you want to call it that, psychotherapy, and this person-centered therapy is very often the foundation of what most people call today counseling. This business of counseling is based on several basic things that I think is important. First of all, Rogers believed that all of us have opportunities. We have what we call a phenomenological field. That phenomenological field means that there's all kinds of possibilities. In other words, we could choose to be a physician, could be an attorney, we could be a surfer, whatever you like. And this is something that we all have an option for. However, those options necessarily they're challenging because not all of them are best for us. As we choose, just like William James suggested, as we choose a particular option, then we become that person. And the main option that we should choose is that option to become self-actualized, to experience the world. We have lots of options, but we experience the world and we actualize by experiencing things. And as we experience them, we become more and more defining. It turns out that I'm not particularly good at golf, but I'm good at walking or running. So I let go of golf and I go in with running. I am not so good at biology, but I like psychology. And as experiences become more defined, we little by little become more understanding or centering of who we are, and as we do that, we slowly become, as we call, actualized. The better we find those experiences, the more defined we become the greater understanding of who we are. Now, each of us have our own unique talents, our own unique limitations. And as we go forward, it's those talents that make us who we are. And there's no perfect person, we just do what's best for us, and within the limits of who we are. Now, along those lines, uh, um, we sometimes find that we don't do a good job, and we are not getting, quote, unconditional positive regard, and that lack of unconditional acceptance makes us maybe wobbly and unable to get a clear understanding of uh, who I am, who the self is, and as a consequence, I'm not involved in a situation where I become self-actualized. And when that happens, then client-centered therapy, this sort of more open therapy, where the focus is on the client, not on the therapist, and that becomes the pathway to improving in order to get to become a person that's self-actualized or fully functioning. Just like Maslow, he suggested that there were qualities, a growing openness to experience, getting a sense of trust in others, having a sense of creativity, positiveness, having a full life. Uh, and the reason that we might end up having problems is because we haven't achieved that. And this is theoretically a goal of all of us, is to get to a place that theoretically reflect who we are and what we can be. Again, in much way that Maslow suggested, uh, we theoretically have all kinds of possibilities, but we have to choose. That choosing is how we become actualized, a fully functioning person. We become centered, uh, um, and in many ways very significant in our thinking today. The last person I want to share with you is somebody that I consider a colleague of mine, and I'm not sure that we would place him here, but I like to take the opportunity to include him, and his name is Martin Seligman, that was born in 1942. Uh, uh, Marty Seligman is a professor of psychology at University of Pennsylvania, and he got his degree at Princeton University, University of Pennsylvania, where he's been at all his life. He is one of the most commonly cited people in the history of psychology, and clearly one of the most prominent personality theories today. He's been there at Pennsylvania his entire career, and so published lots of books. And the one that I want to bring up today is the Hope Circuit, a psychologist's journey to helplessness, from helplessness to optimism. When he was at an early days of Pennsylvania, he was very interested in understanding why is it that people were depressed. And in working with dogs, and he says very unexpectedly, he ended up understanding that that sometimes animals just got tired or became, I don't know, unable to continue, and they just developed a pattern where they just stopped functioning, uh, and um, and because of that, he ended up just simply not, the animal would simply stop functioning. He, together with one of his colleagues by the name of Abramson, came up with the idea that the animal takes an attribution that just simply just gives up. Knowing Dr. Seligman for a number of years, I would say he's not the most positive guy, and in many ways, it was his marriage to his wife that. I'm blocking her name. I had dinner with him not long ago. But anyway, with his marriage, that she said, "Look, Marty, you're just not a very positive individual," and she encouraged him to start rethinking this. So he started moving down a different path, and that path was more positive psychology. He wrote the well-being theory before he wrote the Hope Circuit, but the Hope Circuit, which I had the opportunity to review and before it came out, basically is a story of how he decided that his view of life was so negative and did not reflect a more positive view of the world. And his thinking was along the lines that all things being equal, if we have a different perspective of life, then we might be in a situation where the future brings us more opportunities. So he talks about how we have, as we talked about earlier, how we have a very negative view of personality according to Freud, and the 60s brought us more of a positive view along the lines of Maslow and Rogers. And he adds one more to the equation by saying, all things being equal, we're finding ourselves in a situation where we are more likely to have a more positive view of the world, and that positive view sort of overcomes the attributional style often associated with learned helplessness, and that opens up all kinds of venues. And with it comes a very positive view not only of oneself, but also of our health and subsequently of the world. Positive psychology is probably one of the biggest personality theories going on these days, and at this particular juncture, also one that's maybe more challenged by some, largely because of the research is still early in its infancy, and we'll have to wait and see. All right, so I just wanted to introduce you to that last one. I think the ideas of Rogers and Maslow are clearly more important and have a place in the history of psychology. This is much more new, but we'll see, keeping our fingers crossed how it moves forward. So thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you in person, and good luck on your tests coming up on Tuesday. Thank you. I will call in to share with you questions or go over the test before you start. Take care and have a good day.